So, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the With Chinese Characteristics podcast, Season 2. I'm Natalie.
I'm Cherry.
And together we talk about topics with Chinese characteristics. First day of 2021.
Thank you for coming back.
Yeah.
To us. And happy 2021.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's a good one. It could be worse. You never know.
It's going to be better.
Yeah, I think so too. So, Cherry, what's our topic for today?
Our topic today.
Yeah.
You better cut that out. Our topic today is Peasant Rebellion.
Okay. In China.
In China.
China's had a lot of rebellions, but we're kind of talking about a subset of them today, which is their peasant rebellions. And we're using that term a little loosely because your definition of peasant can change slightly. But we mean it can't be a coup. It can't be the military turning on.
Cannot be an invasion.
Yeah, it can't be an invasion. It's got to be some group of people just go, we've had it. And they just organically start burning stuff and heading towards Beijing.
Yes, or whatever capital it is. Sometimes it's Nanjing.
Yeah, sometimes it's Nanjing. Sometimes it's what?
Sometimes it's
Chongqing.
It's a southern capital or it's a northern capital.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's Chongqing. Yeah.
And so we have 8 of them, and this is going to be a 2-parter. So we're going to talk about 2 now and 2. 4, yeah. 4 now and then 4.
American people, bad at math.
We are bad at math. It's true. But before we start, I want to get into it a little bit. I also want to caveat that some of these things are now called uprisings or civil war, and they've been kind of recontextualized. But, that doesn't sound as good in the title. Violent uprisings, civil wars initiated by...
historians and scholars needs to keep writing new books.
Yeah, right?
And publish new papers.
Exactly.
What's the word? History is fluid.
Yeah, the events are static, but our interpretation of it can keep changing.
Yeah.
So China has a lot of rebellions. There's a concept in Chinese history called the Mandate of Heaven.
Tianmin in Chinese.
Yeah, and it might even be, maybe it's still there, right? That... Well, you don't know. Who knows, Cherry?
You mean the current government?
Yeah, I could lose
believes that they have the Mandate of Heaven?
Yeah, they could lose the Mandate of Heaven.
Like we said in the last episode, the CCP is officially atheist.
Yeah. But the Mandate of Heaven doesn't.
But there's an idea of that. You have the hearts of the people and the minds of the people.
Yeah. So the Mandate of Heaven is basically sort of the concept of turning a bug into a feature, like in a software product. All Chinese dynasties have failed, usually within 200 to 300 years. And sometimes they're replaced with a new dynasty. Sometimes China splits apart for a while and is in war, like in the Three Kingdoms period.
Yeah.
And then eventually it comes back together. You get a new dynasty. So one might look at that and go, oh, this system of dynastic rule is inherently flawed because the emperors, they lose touch, right? The court loses touch. You stop being promoted based on competence, and you just have this weak imperial government with no control outside of the capital, and the countryside just falls into anarchy. But Chinese history has kind of recontextualized that and said, no, that's what's supposed to happen. No dynasty lasts forever. Right? Yeah. And when the time has come, when they have lost the Mandate of Heaven, when they've lost their legitimacy, then naturally some force will come to take it over and form a new strong dynasty.
And it's meant to be.
And it's meant
to be this way.
And it's meant to be. And so that, if somebody is successfully able to take down the imperial court, the provinces, all these other places like Korea and Vietnam, they pay tribute. They all go, okay, well, you're the new emperor.
We'll pay tribute to the new
right,
the new dynasty now.
Yes, it's considered part of the process.
And it's still China.
Yeah, and it's still China, right? It's not even when foreigners come in, like the Mongolians or the Manchurians who form a new dynasty. Basically China goes, the Chinese people as a whole go like, well, if it wasn't supposed to happen, it wouldn't have happened, right? Clearly the gods, heaven, fate, prophecy would have stopped this if it wasn't supposed to happen.
No, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. So, and that's going to come up in some of these rebellions. We each have 2 today, whatever this is. They're both kind of linked. So I'm going to start with my 2.
Okay.
So my first one is the Taiping Rebellion. It happened from basically around 1850 to 1864. So, started around right before the United States Civil War up until during the height of the Civil War in China, which is going to come up as part of this. It was the largest war of the 19th century.
In the world?
Yeah, in the world.
Okay.
Largest war in the world. Also considered the most, if you consider it a civil war, it's the most violent civil war of all time. So our story starts in 1644 when the Manchu people swept into a weakened Song dynasty utilizing unrest and treachery to seize control and form a new imperial dynasty, the Qing. Similar to the Mongols in culture, they were a mounted warrior people who lived in harsher lands than the more sedentary Chinese, and indeed, soon after they took control, they engaged in wars to pacify their borders, including forming alliances with the Mongols, who they kind of had a cultural kinship with. Mm-hmm. And the Manchu continued to keep up their identity and martial prowess with their own language, culture, and elite military units. But over time, they became more and more comfortable as the masters of China. With the borders pacified and the rebellions over, some of the more unpopular policies, such as the Q. Listen to our episode on the Q, the Pigtail Ordinance, or the end of foot binding. The Qing state grew soft. So they came in, even though they're a different culture, they took over the mantle of the Chinese Imperial Dynasty.
Yeah.
They tried to push some stuff through. Some of it stuck, like the Q. Some of it, like ending foot binding, didn't
stuck.
But despite their efforts, they became soft, like all imperial dynasties.
Yeah.
And they kind of lost their connection.
There's a word for it, which will come up with mine, but I think this is a good time.
Oh, what's the word?
Otherwise, it's a missed opportunity. I'm looking for it.
Oh, okay.
I should have highlighted it.
Sinicized?
Yeah. Sinicization, a process whereby non-Chinese societies come under the influence of Chinese culture, particularly Han Chinese culture and social norms. Areas of influence including diet, writing, industry, education, language, law, life, everything, assimilation. But in terms of the Mongols and the Manchurians,
yes,
it's really seen as a way of growing soft.
Yes. Like originally,
like these Han people.
Yeah, and originally, Manchurians, the Manchu people, they weren't allowed to live in the cities. They had to stay back in Manchuria. Only certain parts of the court would come, and they would only come for like a season.
Yes.
Because they didn't want to get soft, right? They wanted to remember how to do all this warrior people stuff.
Yeah.
But, 200 years is a long time.
Yes.
Right? And, you kind of let it slide. So by 1850, with bandits and rebellions cropping up everywhere, the opium trade running rampant, and foreign powers chipping off more and more chunks of China, it seems possible they have lost the mandate of heaven. And I want to read a quote to kind of, and this is a little bit forward, but this is at the height of the Taiping Rebellion. And this is Zheng Guofan. How do you pronounce him?
Zheng Guofan.
Zheng Guofan.
Cute.
Okay. So he ended up being the kind of head general for the Qing, even though he was Han Chinese. One of the things that the Qing did is they wouldn't put Han people in positions of power because they were considered a different ethnic group and they weren't sure if they could trust them. But anyway, so in such uncertain times, even a formerly complacent subject of the emperor might throw his support to the rebels if he thought they were destined to win. The so-called mandate of heaven wasn't supposed to be permanent, and it was understood that every dynasty would eventually end. But the wealthy landowners to whom Zheng appealed most directly had prospered under this dynasty, and in rallying their support for his army, Zheng had to convince them that this was not yet the natural time for the Manchus to fall. So he admitted that circumstances might look remarkably similar to what one expected at the end of the dynasty. Widespread uprisings, near total breakdown of government control, but he insisted that the emperor was better than that. Yes, he wrote, in the final days of the Han, Tang, Yuan, Ming dynasties, the government had lost its grasp on the countryside, and gangs of bandits were as thick as the hairs on your head. But the Jinfeng emperor, he argued, had not, like those past emperors, really lost control.
So who's to say? He's to say. Despite all evidence, despite all criteria.
He's like, I know it looks bad, but this
is not it. Just trust me.
Yeah, this isn't it. So enter Hong Xiuquan. Xiuquan? The Taiping emperor. Xiuquan.
Hong Xiuquan.
Hong Xiuquan.
Yeah.
So enter Hong Xiuqian.
Can we just have the audiences?
No.
It's nothing like what you just said.
Okay, you know what, Cherry?
We often have this problem where Nali would refer to a historical person in Chinese history, and I would have no idea who that is, and I would be like, did I just not read enough?
No.
Yeah.
Clearly, yeah, you just need to get better at Chinese. Hong Zhouquan?
Hong Xiuqian.
Hong Xiuqian.
Just say Hong. Just Hong. Yeah.
So Hong Xiuqian, Confucian scholar,
Yeah.
and the only hope his entire village, meaning family group, because villages were often like a whole clan, all interrelated. He was the only hope his entire village had of escaping crushing poverty. By passing the civil servant exam, he would become fabulously wealthy and raise the status of his entire extended family. So in China,
It's like a common story.
yes,
Yeah.
like today, there was a exam that you had to pass in order to become a civil servant. And a civil servant, we think of it like somebody who works at the DMV, but in Imperial China, you're basically like a politician, right? You pass it and you become like a governor of a province or of a city, or
A local official.
Yeah, you become put in charge of some, customs house, whatever it is. Get all these bribes, and then you pass the money back to your village, and everybody wins.
So corruption is part of the system. It's built in.
Yeah, it's built in. It's assumed. That's why you want to do it, right? I mean, it's so you get corrupt. It's like when CEOs don't
Ask what you can do for your country.
yeah.
That's not the reason why.
What China can do for you. It's the same way when CEOs don't take a salary. It's like, you don't need to take a salary, right? You're getting, stock or whatever you're getting, right?
Yeah.
However, after failing the exam multiple times, and you have to wait years between each exam. And when we say exam, it is also, it's more corrupt than that, because it's an exam where you have to write essays about Confucius, a guy who's been dead for 2,000 years. And, you're graded.
How disrespectful.
I know. And you're graded, and it's really just like, does the proctor who reads your essay like it, right? And obviously, if you have
it's very objective. It's
subjective.
It's very subjective.
And if you have some sort of link to the people who run the exam, right, you can get away with stuff. So anyway, so he didn't have any connection. He failed three or four times. I forget what it was. So it's like 20 years of his life. So he's like 45. He broke down, became suicidal, and started receiving visions.
Can you blame him?
I know, right? And the whole village, had been counting on him.
Yeah.
So he was unable to understand them, however, until he came upon a translated Christian missionary text. So I'm not sure what the actual text was, but somebody had translated part of the Bible into Chinese.
So at this point, there are Christian missionaries in China?
No, there are not. They're only in the foreign zones. At this point, even though the only white people to ever go into the interior of China are armies, because you can't, you'll be killed, right? Essentially white people do not have passage into China except in rare circumstances.
All right.
But, but there's missionary stations on the coast. These things get printed in Chinese and they get distributed into the interior. He read this missionary text, part of the Bible, and he interpreted the visions to mean that he was the younger brother of Christ and that Christ wanted him to found a new kingdom. So, and then basically he starts a rebellion. Right? He gets his friends, his family in the village. They start,
are they
burning stuff.
His first believers?
Stuff. They're the first believers, right? And so at the start, it's very much a religious movement. But after a while, people kind of come on who aren't really true believers. So there's a couple of things that the movement had that made it very popular.
Okay.
So one, it was pro-Chinese and anti-Manchu. So
you mean pro-Han Chinese?
Pro-Han Chinese. Well, no, pro-Chinese, not just Han, because he was not Han Chinese. The original people who started it were not Han Chinese. They were Hakka Chinese, which is a different ethnic group. Yeah. And most of the people in the early stages of the rebellion were not Han Chinese.
So the only ethnic group they're against is the ruling class.
Yeah, it's the Manchu. And they want to do things like bring back original Chinese dress, get rid of the queue.
Okay.
The Manchus speak their own language. They live in separate areas of the city.
Yeah.
And so there's a nationalist.
So they're really like these Manchus. They are the foreigners.
Yes. And it is because the Manchus didn't assimilate. They have a distinct culture, right? And so even though these ethnic group is not Han Chinese, they still view themselves as Chinese. And the Manchus do not view themselves as Chinese. So they're saying, no, we got to liberate China.
Okay.
It was anti-bureaucracy because it was against Confucius. It was against the imperial examination system and the imperial government system. It was pro-technology and was, at least relatively speaking, a meritocracy instead of being based on Confucian family connections. Almost everybody was a peasant, because why would you join this rebellion if you were already,
not a peasant?
if you had succeeded, right, in the Manchu state? It had some progressive beliefs, such as land and tax reform.
Yeah.
And it was in some ways less cruel than the imperial system, less inclined to violent executions and retribution. So when they took a city, they wouldn't kill everybody, which is just par for the course for imperial China. If a city rebelled and you took it, you would just kill everybody.
Do you think the religious backdrop is that part of the reason?
No, I think it's just practical, because it's like, well,
it's not that
you
God is good.
Yeah, you got to get more people, right? And obviously, when you're dealing with all of China, like, what are you going to do? Kill everybody in China? So yeah, so it was considered, in some ways, it was positive. Now, they were also religious zealots. They had a lot of crazy beliefs, but so did imperial China, right? So, by comparison, it at least looks equal in terms of atrocities and stuff. Probably even better.
Okay.
So you could leave your soul-crushing life as a farmer, whose life is controlled by the elderly father, to join the Taiping, find money, power, and salvation, and you didn't have to cut your hair. And also, what all the early people did, and even maybe later, is you were supposed to burn down your house when you joined. So there's no return.
Oh, boy.
You're in it to win it. The movement was extremely successful from the start, forming huge armies and routing imperial forces. Genocide was extremely frequent on both sides, and the attempts by the Qing to stamp it out were hampered by their unwillingness to commit their theoretically best Mongol and Manchu troops to the battle, as the emperor wished to keep them near Beijing.
Okay.
Because, the best troops were still Mongol or Manchu, like mounted warriors and things.
Sure, yeah.
And they didn't, the emperor didn't trust the loyalty of other armies, so he wanted those to stay by the capital. So foreign powers were unclear what to make of the new state, though all were uneasy at the unrest to trade, as the Taiping controlled some of the richest areas on the Yangtze near Shanghai. Many believed that they should support the rebellion, which was theoretically Christian, pro-foreigner, and was interested in international trade and modernization. This is comparison to the Qing Empire, which clearly distrusted foreigners. I think at this point they still officially refer to all foreigners as barbarians. So, we
still do today.
Right?
Yeah.
You would come and they'd go, the barbarian delegation is here to see the emperor or whatever.
Yeah.
So in the end, the empire, the rebellion failed, right? Or civil war, how you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
Because the empire was saved by two things. One was the unshaking loyalty of the scholar turned general, Zhang Guofan.
Good job.
Oh, did I say it okay?
That's not bad. That's
okay.
pretty good.
To his undying loyalty to the Qing state. He was the guy whose quote I read earlier. So he also, like the Taiping emperor, was a peasant, but he passed his exam. And he wasn't necessarily a peasant, right? But he was very poor.
Yeah.
But he passed his exam, and he got admitted to the Hanlin Academy in Beijing, which is like the Harvard, the top of the top for the Confucian schools. And if you basically pass there, you're the elite, right?
Yeah.
So he was very loyal to the state because he felt like it gave him everything he had. And when he was in his 50s, one of the things he was ordered to do was to create a militia in Hunan province, which is where Mao was from, actually. He created this militia, and it ended up becoming the largest and most powerful army in China. And the reason it's sort of a militia is because really, for the most part, Han Chinese were not allowed to form army units. You had these things called like the Green Banners or the Green Forces, which were...
Oh, so he had to organize an unofficial army.
Yeah,
for the Qin Dynasty.
With the backing of the Qing Dynasty, though. But still, it was, it wasn't originally supposed to be an army. It was just supposed to be a militia. So he built the army on Confucian principles, where everybody who joined the army had to know somebody in it. And it was all based down to family units in villages. And if anybody ran away, you would burn down their whole village. And so it was all very interconnected. It's very Confucian.
Very Chinese.
Very, very extremely Chinese. His army, with some setbacks, eventually managed to contain the Taiping and eventually push them back with the assistance of the British and some French. So basically, the problem that the Taiping had was that, and there's a lot more to it, there's a lot of details, but basically, they wanted Shanghai, and they wanted to move to the east to take everything up to the ocean. But the foreigners didn't know who these Taiping were, and they essentially fought them when they tried to take Shanghai, and they kept it. And then the Qing used Shanghai as a base, and they hired Western mercenaries. Like there's the ever victorious army and other people. They would basically hire these mercenaries to attack Taiping towns, and the Taiping couldn't really retaliate because they didn't want to start a war with the West. So it really kind of screwed over their one whole flank of their position. And the other part of that was Zheng basically just throwing countless bodies into it until eventually they pushed them back. But why would the British and French help?
Yeah, why?
The Qing Empire. Because, around this time,
I thought the Qing Empire didn't treat them very well.
It treated them badly. And also, this is the same point in time. While the rebellion's going, the British and French are burning down the Summer Palace, which is the famous, great injustice.
The shame of...
where basically the Qing forces basically killed and tortured some British and French ambassadors, and in retaliation, the British and French went and burned down the Summer Palace and looted
atrocity still.
Yeah. So
I'm supposed to believe.
So you go, like, why would they turn around like a year or so later and help the Qing?
To suppress an uprising against them.
Yeah, a pro-foreigner, Christian, modern,
off-brand
Christian. But we can work with them. It's close enough, right? I think it's partially sort of just the devil They didn't know who these Taiping were. They didn't know what they were going to do.
They needed China to be stable, don't they? Because they wanted to trade.
Yeah, they wanted trade. They sold opium. They bought tea. They got silk. All these things from China. And it's like, yeah, on the one hand, the Taiping might be better, but we know who the Qing are. We can deal with them. Their emperor calls us barbarians, but at least we know where he lives, right?
We know where he lives.
There's a process.
We can go burn down that palace too if we need it.
That palace too.
Yeah. Okay, so that makes some sense.
Yes. So basically, foreigners also sold guns, both to the Taiping and the Qing, but they sold them officially to the Qing court. And they also trained and led mercenary units. So basically...
war's the best business, really, sometimes.
Exactly.
For other people.
However, it was kind of a short-lived partnership because once British and French units or mercenaries actually started hanging around Qing army units and fighting with them, they got pretty sketched out by the atrocities, where basically, like a city would surrender and the general would go like, okay, I'll surrender the city. I won't fight you, but you have to promise to let my men go or, do whatever. The British guy there would be like, yes, on my honor, we will surrender the city. And then they do it. And then the Qing would just murder them all. Right? The officer would come back the next morning and see a bunch of heads in a ditch, right?
Yeah.
So it really bothered them, right? Even though, they were selling opium to these people and doing all this stuff, they didn't like to get their hands dirty, and they felt like
they wanted to keep the
optics,
the appearance of civility.
Yes. So they withdrew their support, but it was kind of too late. Taiping were defeated, lasting almost 15 years and with 20 to 30 million dead. It was the most destructive war of the 19th century, perhaps the bloodiest civil war of all time. The only one that may have been worse is the Three Kingdoms period, because that lasted almost 100 years of Chinese history. And that might have been almost 100 million people dead. It also left...
But also it was many, many years ago.
Yes, many years ago. It also left Zheng Guofan the most powerful person in the Qing Empire. By the end, he just was not listening to the emperor anymore. The emperor would just tell him to do stuff. And he was like, I know what I'm doing. So he would just kind of ignore it.
Yeah. So the people were right. The emperor was weak.
Yes,
and
exactly.
it is the time.
Yes.
Maybe it's just his time.
And everybody said, you should just take over the capital, right? Because if you're the only one keeping this together.
Yeah.
You're Chinese. You understand Confucius.
Declare yourself emperor.
Declare yourself emperor. He can't stop you, right? Yeah. You have modern forces now. You have weapons.
Why didn't he?
Because he just was like, no, I want to be a Confucian scholar. I just want to meditate and write essays about Confucius. So he wouldn't do it.
Okay.
And while a lot of his students, like I think you know who Li Hongzhang is,
Li Hongzhang?
yeah, he was one of his disciples.
Okay.
So a lot of his disciples went on to do very powerful things
Yeah.
after he died, but he just retired basically. But in the end, everybody lost. One of the reasons why the British got involved, their two biggest markets were China and the United States. And the United States was starting the Civil War in 1960. And basically they're like, we can't lose our two biggest markets. British were like, we got to fix one market or the other. So they decided to try and fix China. But after the war ended, British trade collapsed because it turns out war is very good for trade. And when the Qing
Arms trade at least.
and also all of these merchants who would otherwise trade inside of China traded outside China instead, because the whole countryside was full of bandits and armies and everything else. So they would just send all the stuff down the river to Shanghai because that was safer.
Okay.
Right? Or British ships would go up the river to trade because they have guns. So basically trade fell as soon as the war ended. The British basically got no recognition for their help.
All right.
And the Qing were just like, thanks, we're done.
Alternative history idea. What if the British had chosen to get involved in the American Civil War instead?
Well, that is a well-trod topic, right?
I'm sure, yeah.
The Qing Empire continued. Zheng Guofan and his family were dragged down by the Manchu court once his armies had disbanded. He died in mysterious circumstances. People think they might have gotten away with, but basically, as soon as his armies disbanded, the court, just mired him in scandals and politics and shenanigans, and he never really got any rest until he died. The people of China continued to suffer under a failing dynasty that could not properly protect them from bandits, natural disasters, or foreign attackers. In the end, the Qing Empire would survive for another 50 years until another revolutionary, raised on the tales of Taiping heroes, managed to succeed in 1913. Named Chen, by his friends, Sun Yat-sen would be recognized as the father of modern China.
Yeah.
So he was nicknamed after the Taiping.
Oh, okay.
Right? He viewed them as the people he was inheriting,
a nation from?
The
An
will
idea.
of. Yes.
The torch.
Yes. The communists also viewed the Taiping as like proto-communists because they viewed things like land reform and stuff.
Yeah.
So they're viewed as almost like communist heroes too.
Well, the communists, at least in today's formal history, education, peasant rebellions are always good.
Yes, right?
We always want.
We
always praise them.
If only they'd had Mao.
If only they had it, yeah. They were like on the right trajectory. They just needed an enlightened leader.
So basically, the kind of consensus is among historians is that the Taiping probably would have won if left to their own devices, and that the foreigners, and even some foreigners at the time, were going to just leave it alone, right?
Yeah.
You're just going to make it worse if you get involved. Whoever wins is still not going to like you. Just let it play out. This is just what happens in China. But they had to meddle, and they basically did the worst option, which is the war dragged on, millions of people died, and you're left with a weak dynasty that is going to fall anyway. Let's fast forward now to 40 years later. So we're now at 1898. There's almost 1 million Christian Chinese in China, most of them Catholic, which were done by French missionaries. Who were very, very prolific in China. There was an event in 1870. So one of the things that happened, is that after the Taiping Rebellion, after the burning of the Summer Palace, one of the things in the surrender document, not the surrender, but the document that the emperor was forced to sign to the Western powers, is that you had to let missionaries travel through China. Once that happened, immediately you had foreign missionaries preaching Christianity all through China, which they could not do before. So in a very short time, you go from basically no Christians in China, aside from the Taiping, to hundreds of thousands to millions of them. And a lot of Chinese people did not like it. So there was an event in 1870 called the Tianjin Massacre, where there were French orphanages. One thing that really bothered foreign missionaries was infanticide, which is where Chinese families would kill children either because they didn't want them, they were the wrong gender, various reasons.
Yes.
Which is a problem up until this day.
Yes, we can just say they're girls. We don't have to say they're
Yeah,
the wrong
right?
gender. People don't know what the right gender
Yeah,
is.
they're girls.
Yeah.
So they would kill them.
Yeah.
And this bothered foreign missionaries. So a big early thing that they did was orphanages.
Yeah.
And either
I've
send them
heard of
back to
that.
the United States or raise them in China. And Chinese people did not trust this because they thought there had to be some sort of ulterior motive. They thought they can't just be doing this because they care about these children.
Yeah.
And they believe they're holy and, images of God or whatever else.
Yeah.
It must be a sex thing. They must be, stealing their organs to
I thought
make
there
drugs.
was also a thing where they're eating the babies.
Yeah, they're eating the baby. So there's all these, things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so basically there was a riot in 1870. They killed a bunch of French priests. And
for taking the abandoned babies.
Yes. And
the babies were supposed to die.
And who investigated it but in one of his last duties, a year or so before his death.
Let me guess, Zheng Guofan.
Zheng Guofan.
Yeah.
He investigated it. He interviewed like the kids, and
Okay.
he's like, "Yeah, the priest didn't do anything wrong,
Yeah.
right?"
Mm-hmm.
And he apologized. China sent a apology mission to France
Okay.
to apologize.
Yeah.
And a thing that was in negotiation, which was a sort of a code of conduct for missionaries, a legal framework to put missionaries in that would put them in the same category as like Buddhist and Taoist priests, was nixed by the Western powers. They went, no, we're not signing anything. If anything happens to our priests or anything, it's on you, and we're gonna it's gonna be blood. So what that meant then was that suddenly Christians in China had a sort of legal protection.
Official legal protection from the government.
Sort of unofficial though, because
Okay.
because they're backed by the Western powers.
Yeah. So, but even though this killing was initiated by the peasants, right?
Yes.
It wasn't the Qing Dynasty. The court wasn't doing this.
No, the court wasn't doing this. This
Right.
was a native sort of distrust of these Christians.
But they're on the ropes for it. They're going to be responsible if it should happen again.
Yes. And so what started happening was you would have Christians, whether this is abuse or this is legitimate, Chinese Christians would use foreign missionaries and the threat of foreign power to intervene in legal disputes. Like two people are having a dispute,
Okay.
and then the Chinese Christian would tell a priest, like, I'm being persecuted, right? And the priest would go like, oh, I'll come see to that. And you would have a Western priest or missionary or somebody get involved, and normally then they would win. And so whether or not how exactly widespread
That's got to
this
piss
was,
some people off.
it would piss people off, right? And I'm sure a lot of times it was legitimate discrimination, right? Chinese Christians were discriminated against, right?
Well, I can imagine sometimes it's not either.
Yes.
It's also not.
Yes.
Not
also,
illegitimate. Yeah.
and
I think
also,
probably happens. Both probably happen.
Yes, both
sometime.
probably happen. And also Chinese Christians were got a lot of charity from churches. A lot of times they're from like a smaller ethnic groups that were persecuted. They were called like rice Christians derisively by other Chinese, because it's like, you're just becoming a Christian, so you get free rice from the temple, right?
All right.
So this goes on for another 3 decades, basically. Widespread belief in evil rituals by Christian, that they could control the weather, and also in other things. And also they lumped them in with industrialization and railroads and steamships, because now you have all of these classes of labor, people who would transport goods on their backs and unpack things, or row ships, or all these traditional forms of labor are now obsolete because the Westerns are building railroads all through China.
So it's the old tale of they took our jobs.
Yes, they took our jobs. So these people, they have a weird religion. We don't like them. They smell like milk, and they're taking our jobs. So basically, all this comes to a head in 1898, because you have a huge drought around Beijing. You have widespread banditry, and you have, a complete still breakdown of the imperial system. And you have all these essentially martial arts groups, and their various names, who formed originally as anti-bandit forces. And their belief is that, it's all kind of varied, but it's like kung fu stuff, and that they can perform these rituals and they can gain the power of the ancestors, and it'll make them fight better. They can power up They can't be shot. And they do these mass kind of mobilizations, these mass martial arts demonstrations.
Okay.
Basically, it starts to ramp up more and more, and they start killing foreigners. And once foreigners start getting killed, it's like an electric shock, and it's just everybody's suddenly like, all right, we're doing it now, right? Now's the time. We're going to kill these foreigners, and we're going to throw them out of China because we don't like them. We're going to burn down the railroads. We're going to go back to a traditional, Chinese culture. So the interesting thing is they're anti-foreign instead of anti-Manchu. So one of their slogans was it's sort of there's a Japanese one that's similar, but it's basically like support the Qing or support the Manchu throughout the foreigners.
You think maybe it came from the desire of wanting a strong government?
Yeah, I think it's partially just that the Manchus were seen as so one of the things that the Taiping Rebellion was it was violently anti-Confucian. And that was one of the things that hampered it. Because unlike previous rebellions, it's not like you can just switch sides as a Confucian scholar or official to the new side. It's like they don't want you.
Yeah.
All the Confucian temples are going to get burned down. All the texts are going to get burned down. So even though they're pro-Chinese, they're also anti-Confucius. And so the Qing, in defeating them, became seen as the defenders of Confucianism, of traditional Chinese culture, of all this stuff. So the Boxers are a throwback to that. And I think now they're viewing Qing as the defenders of the Chinese culture against foreign culture. And also they're in northern China, which is going to be more have to do with the Manchurians and Manchu culture than southern China.
They were closer to
They're closer to it, right?
Gotcha.
The Taiping Rebellion started in southern China, even south of like Shanghai, and Nanjing, which is a much different culture, right, than northern China. So
China's a big place.
China is a big place.
Yeah.
So originally, the court took some measures to stop them because they're like, oh God, they're going to kill all these foreigners. The foreigners are going to get mad. We're going to have to deal with it. But they all failed. The Boxers would just kill any Manchus that got in their way.
Oh boy.
Or Manchu forces. The court basically means Cixi, who's the Dowager Empress, the most powerful woman in the world besides Queen Victoria, who's about to die. Basically, they're like, well, maybe we just get on board with this, right? Maybe if we try and suppress it, it's our problem. But if we roll with it, it's the foreigners' problem. And maybe we can drive them out of China. Foreigners started streaming into the capital. Chinese Christians started streaming towards the coast to treaty ports and things like that. And they were like, hey, Manchus, Qing Empire, are you going to do something about this? And they're like, oh, sorry, we didn't get your letter. So they just kind of ignored them. Railroad engineers were killed, all these sort of stuff. Still not understanding the full danger. Some people did, though. Or not realizing the rebellion was an anti-foreign one. The legations in the capital, because one of the things that also happened after the Taiping Rebellion and also the burning down of the Summer Palace was now there's permanent embassies in the Qing capital in Beijing. So these legations, which are from all these different countries all over the world, requested permission from the Qing government to station guards in the city. Under treaty, the Russians were the only ones, I guess, who were allowed to station guards. But everybody's like, hey, can we just bring in some guards for this unrest? And eventually the Qing said yes. So 350 soldiers from all these different nations, mostly Marines and naval infantry, arrived by train. America, Britain, Russia, France, Italy, and Japan all made an appearance, with Austria and Germany arriving shortly behind.
Yeah.
There was not great cooperation. People argued over who gets to sit in what parts of the train, who's in charge, all these things. This was before any international framework like the United Nations to organize multinational efforts, and many of these nations would be at war. So like Russia and Japan, 5 years from now, they're going to be fighting the Russo-Japanese War. So, they're not allies, right? Yeah. They're just kind of all in the same situation. So things began to escalate. The chancellor of the Japanese legation was hacked apart in the street. The German minister was shot, and basically all hell broke loose. And this was in 1990. So there's like a year of buildup, right? From the original...
1990? 1890?
1900.
Okay.
Right? So, now basically the countryside and everything is in full rebellion, right? Boxers are going around, killing any foreigners they can get their hand on, destroying the railway, so more reinforcements can't come. There's an attempt to relieve the foreign legations because there's like 1,000 people there, right? This isn't just a couple people, right? These are, and there's women, there's families, there's, it's all, lots of people. So they start killing every Chinese Christian they can get their hands on. They burn down the railroads. There's a relief force of 2,000 Marines that gets stopped. Because basically one of the problems is that the foreign powers have been selling modern weapons to the Qing for 2,000 or for 40 years. And so in some cases the Qing have better weapons than the foreigners because China is poor in the sense that, it's a huge place and there's lots of poverty, but the court has money.
Yeah.
And, they only have a couple elite units.
So those elite units are pretty well equipped.
They have all the best stuff you can have.
Okay.
And so, a lot of times they have better stuff than the Westerners. So 2,000 people, they get pushed back. They have to retreat to the coast, and the coastal ports get put under siege. And at this point, the regular Chinese army is fighting with the Boxers. So the Boxers are kind of the crazy martial arts people trying to fight people with swords, but eventually they start using guns too because, they want to win. So they're hemmed in on the coast. Cixi, again, revoked the diplomatic status of all the Peking diplomats, calls troops to the capitals, and essentially declares war. After a long debate, the foreign legations decided to just stay there because they didn't want to get murdered on the open road, trying to leave in Beijing.
That would be wise.
Yes. So they didn't trust the Qing to actually not kill them. So an important thing, and you'll know this name, Yuan Shikai, who is one of the most infamous figures in this time period.
Yuan Shikai for our Chinese listeners.
Yes, was one of the generals of these new elite Chinese divisions that had modern equipment, and he completely stayed out of this. Cixi ordered him to come to the capital, and he just ignored it because he wanted to keep his army intact for whatever was going to come afterwards because he knew this was stupid.
Yeah.
So a lot of people ignored it.
Well, that army really did him good later on.
Right.
Which we'll get into in another episode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of people in the West thought that these legations were dead because, there's 30 or 40,000 elite Chinese troops. There's hundreds of thousands maybe of Boxers. And what are they going to do, right? There's 1,000 people, and maybe 300 of them are soldiers. Yeah. They're all going to be dead. So they thought they had, at this point, they were first thinking it's more about revenge. But eventually they found out, somehow they're still alive. So now we have to go rescue them.
Yeah.
They got a force together of 20,000 people. They fought their way to the coast. Most of them were Japanese and Russian because those are the two places that are closest. In the end, the major powers, it's called the Eight Nations Alliance, is Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, the United States, Japan, Russia. I think I'm missing one. Anyway, there's 8 of them.
Yeah.
They went in and
the
it's
infamous 八国联军 by
my
memory.
know it's infamous. And it's interesting also because there's no framework for how you coordinate international forces because it's not like today where you have the United Nations or you have NATO.
Yeah.
There's a framework. These people, if they met in other places, would be fighting each other. So who do you put in charge, right? And there's also some competition over who gets to attack first and who gets to take a gate and people get killed because
who gets
everybody
the glory too.
Yes. So eventually they liberate the city.
Okay.
And the reason why the foreign legation wasn't destroyed is because essentially it's not clear. At the time they thought just because we're real good at fighting, right? Because we're white people. But very quickly they realized okay, the Qing court could not decide what to do because you have Cixi and you have certain people who are let's kill them all. But then you had other people who were
maybe that's not a good idea.
Maybe this isn't a good idea. Yeah. And so they would act like they were attacking.
Let's start World War I before World War I
starts.
Yeah.
They would shoot over people's heads. They would, set off firecrackers. So Cixi would look and be like, oh yeah, they're really fighting, right? But they wouldn't actually kind of go for it.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'd have different commanders come in who would really attack, right? And then people get killed, but maybe they wouldn't succeed. So it was kind of it was a shit show. They take back the city. They relieve the legation quarter. There's lots of looting. Sushi flees. And now they're like, well, what do we do? Right? And it kind of reminds me of the situation of like Iraq in 2003 with the U.S. government, where they go like, okay, we want to take out Saddam Hussein. But then you take him out and it's like, well, what do you do? Right? Like now suddenly you don't have a country anymore.
I think it's sort of the situation with all hell breaks loose.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
Because now if you completely destroy the Qing Dynasty, then it's just an anarchy, right?
Yeah.
They're like, okay, we have three options. We split China up into colonies. Everybody gets a piece.
Raising my eyebrows.
Yes, right? So, which is kind of already what had been happening, right? In slow motion, right? All these little pieces that already got chipped off. So we either split China into colonies, we overthrow the dynasty and find a new one.
Yeah.
So we just pick someone.
And that's always a good idea.
Yeah, right?
Always. Always going to work out.
Or we prop up the Manchus,
Yeah.
which we did before.
Yeah.
So they decided to just prop up the Manchus again.
I mean, in retrospect, that might have been a wise decision. I don't know.
It kind of just kicks the can down the road.
Pick your
right?
poison, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So they also argued over indemnities, and the U.S. sort of famously, A, argued for let's not split China up into colonies, and B,
so we can have a piece of it.
Yeah, right. Well, they didn't.
I'm being cynical, but yeah.
Yeah, but they didn't, and also they didn't want harsh indemnities, which is also going to mirror World War I, where they're like, let's just kind of not keep, trying to steal stuff from each other. The German general complained, the U.S. seems to desire that nobody shall get anything out of China. Like that, no one's going to get any booty. The terms were rather light. In the end, Sushi immediately accepted and also immediately attempted to scrub her support from the rebellion from the official record. Where basically she's like, what? The regular army? They weren't involved. It was all these boxers, right? Like,
yeah.
What? I had nothing. I was fleeing too, right? Wasn't that crazy, everybody? What a crazy situation this was. And then she held audience with them, gave everybody presents. And, so this is all sort of strange.
So let's forget about this.
Yes.
It's all good.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to figure out why the boxers and the armies weren't able to take the foreign legation. Because they had, hundreds of cannons and all these things. And you read the reports and it's like, the whole time there'll be like 2 cannons shooting into the foreign legation, right? When it's like, they have like, tens of thousands of soldiers and all these modern explosive cannons. They could have leveled the place if they wanted to.
Yeah.
But all of those orders, all of those reports, all of those diaries essentially have been destroyed because Sushi were like,
didn't
burn
want
it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Let's get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
So over time, the Boxer Rebellion became associated with Chinese nationals and communists. And both Mao and Sun Yat-sen celebrated their efforts. The image of poor rural Chinese rising up and fighting corruption became particularly popular among Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
70 years later. In fact, Red Guards stormed the British legation in 1967 in extremely similar circumstances. Some of the young protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989 told foreign reporters that they felt like the boxers of old, invincible to bullets.
Oh boy, got a legacy that lives on. Yeah,
it's interesting because in foreign, it's like, man, those crazy Chinese, right? But within China, it's much more heroically seen.
Yeah.
Right? Of like, these people are just poor farmers and peasants, but even though they just have, swords, they went up and tried to defeat all these Western powers.
Yeah. So it depends on who you are. You might have different opinions about the Boxer Rebellion.
And I want to say, though, I want to put a caveat is that a lot of people are now starting to refer to it as the Boxer Uprising because the argument is they're not rebelling against the Qing, they're rebelling against foreigners. But I would argue they are rebelling against the Qing because it's the Qing's policy on foreigners.
Yeah.
And if the Qing had tried to stop them...
It's more like they didn't agree with the Qing's policy.
Yes.
So they're like, we're going to do it ourselves.
Yes. And if the Qing had tried to stop them, they would have fought the Qing too.
Yeah.
So I know. It's kind of your opinion. Okay, Cherry. So what do you have for your peasant rebellions?
We're going to talk about 2 peasant rebellions. The Min Dynasty.
Okay.
A dynasty that began and ended with peasant rebellions. The dynasty that before the Min Dynasty was Yuan Dynasty. And it was the first foreign-led or ethnic minority-led dynasty in China's history.
So essentially you have Genghis Khan, and these people, they took over all these areas.
Yeah.
And then they shift. Instead of being the Mongol Empire, now they're essentially the Chinese Empire.
The Khans, they would act both as the Mongol leader and the Chinese emperor.
But
It's a very flexible system.
But being the Chinese emperor is more fun than being the Mongol.
The dynasty was established by Kublai Khan in 1279. Halfway through the dynasty, things were looking a bit shaky. Started to look a bit shaky.
After Kublai Khan died.
It always happens after the first emperor dies. The first emperor is good times. Just, ushers in a new age, and then it goes downhill from there. So the first thing, from 1320 to 1332, in 12 years, 6 emperors of the Yuan dynasty came and went. A revolving door.
I'm guessing it wasn't because they all retired.
No, retirement is not a choice. In drug trade or in the business of being a Chinese emperor. So
it's blood in, blood out, right?
Yes. So one of the emperor became emperor twice. First reigned for 1 year. He abdicated the throne for his younger brother, and then his younger brother mysteriously died after a state banquet, and he became the emperor again.
So it's all these, and they're all Mongol emperors.
They're all Mongol emperors.
And so they're just what? They're poisoning each other, they're killing each other.
Well, there was a coup, and then there was one with sudden death for no reason, at the age of at very young ages. And there's one disappeared in a civil war between different Mongol families as a struggle for power.
Okay, and through all this civil war,
yeah,
the Chinese peasants are just kind of caught in the middle of it.
They are just keeping their head down.
Okay.
And the Mungo Empire, it was an expansionism sort of an empire.
Okay.
So they constantly had to reach out, and they required considerable military expenditure to maintain its vast controlled areas.
Okay.
So the revolving door of emperors, on average, one every 2 years. Some of them only reigned as short as 2 months. Didn't look good. And what else that's on the checklist for the beginning of
losing the mandate of heaven?
Losing the mandate of heaven? Well, it would be a pandemic.
In Christianity, you have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You have war, plague, famine, and disease.
Well, I would say...
So we have war.
Right? Yeah. And I would say pandemic.
Okay.
And I would say natural diseases, natural disasters.
Okay.
Which would include...
Floods, earthquakes,
droughts, and then will lead to famines.
Okay. So we have basically all 4. What's the disease? What's the pandemic?
Well, the Black Death, famously. So let me say this first. The Black Death in China was in no way as well documented as it was in Europe. In China, we just call it the plague. But many research show that, it was in China. And it's just that at the time, there was also a lot of other cause of death in China for a regular Chinese peasant. So some research shows that in Hebei province, which was the surrounding province of Beijing, the capital, so very important, 9 out of 10 people were killed by the Black Death in 1333, when the last emperor of the Yuan dynasty ascended the throne.
Okay.
And that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And by 1351, as much as 2/3 of China's entire population had died of a combination of causes, including the bubonic plague, including the famine, including the civil war, probably.
Natural disasters.
Yes. So bad times for everyone. And the ministers at the Yuan court at the time decided that the root cause for all the problems, not the civil war, not the natural disaster, not by luck, it was Sinicization.
They were becoming too Chinese, and that was making the river flood.
They've gone soft. So reportedly, one of the Yuan ministers proposed that all Chinese throughout the empire with the last names Zhang, Wang, Liu, Li, and Zhao to be executed. And these are very, very common Chinese last names.
So, basically, we need to kill all the middle class, Lao Baixin, old 100 names Chinese.
Yes. So this estimatedly would kill about 90% of the peasant population. Thankfully, it was never carried out. It was merely a suggestion and a proposal. But, it goes to show you the political landscape of the time.
Yeah.
And how shaky things were. And from the late 1340s onwards, people in the countryside suffered from frequent natural disasters. So, another check, such as droughts, floods, and the resulting famine. And the government's lack of effective policy led to a loss of popular support. The same old tale. Losing of mandate of the heaven for every dynasty. One of the natural disasters that were particularly bad was the Yellow River flooding. The emperor ordered many construction projects that enlisted local laborers to build new embankments alongside the river. And in some areas, each household was forced to contribute at least one laborer to the project. Otherwise, you have to pay a tax. Working conditions was terrible. Pay was little. Long story short, the mass wasn't happy.
So it's just kind of more and more stuff.
Yes. And also, the pay was so little because of the local corruption. And so add all these things together. You have a peasant rebellion.
Yeah.
Right? That was mandated. In 1351, here comes the Red Turban Rebellion.
Okay.
So the Red Turban Army, Hong Jong, was originally started by the followers of the White Lotus Society to resist the Mongols.
China loves its secret societies.
We
Japan does
do.
too.
Right? The White Lotus originated as a hybrid movement of Buddhism and Manichaeism that emphasized strict vegetarianism. They covered up their usual activities and gatherings as incense burning ceremonies. Just, peaceful incense burning, very spiritual.
But that's where they made their plans to overthrow the Yuan Dynasty.
Exactly. The name Red Turban Army was used because peasant armies were using red banners and wearing red turbans to distinguish themselves. And it was not just one Red Turban Army that had led the rebellion, but rather it began on a more sporadic basis.
Yeah, because everyone was mad. So just individually, people would just go and burn down the local government building.
It started with the first conflict started by this man called Fang Guozhen, who was a smuggler of illegal salt. And, not official salt.
Like Han Solo.
Yeah.
The smuggler.
Yes. He and his men, a few thousand of them allegedly, assaulted a group of Yuan officials in the coastal province of Zhejiang, which is a big trade hub, and stole a bunch of cargoes. After that, the White Lotus north of Yellow River started their rebellion too. Uprisings started popping up all over China, all under the same banner though, the Red Turban flag.
Yeah.
And now, some of these rebellion forces had the idea of restoring the Song Dynasty because Yuan Dynasty, for all its glory and its vast empire, short-lived, so the memory is still fresh.
Because there's people who are still alive almost probably during the Song Dynasty.
Yes, right, or they'll be very old, but the memory's there. At least that was some of these Red Turban Army's propaganda. In 1352, so this is happening all over China.
Yeah.
1352, in Guangzhou province, a Buddhist monk, the future Min Dynasty founder Zhu Yuanzhang, joined the rebellion.
Okay.
And now Zhu Yuanzhang is a true peasant. He grew up poor in the countryside with a family of peasant tenant farmers. Several of his siblings were given away by his parents because they didn't have enough food to support all the children.
So was he given away to like a temple then to be a monk?
He wasn't, but his siblings were.
Okay.
They could only keep a few of them, I guess. He used to work as a cattle herder for the landowners in town. And at the age of 16, so this would be the year of 1344, a famine killed all of his family members except for him and one of his brothers.
Okay.
So he became a Buddhist monk, and he learned to read and write during this time. Then, for about 3 years during, the local Buddhist monastery ran out of money, and he was let go. So he was a beggar on the street, right? So he knows the life of a peasant. He is a true peasant.
Yes.
So just show you how this was a peasant rebellion.
Yeah.
So when he was 25, he joined one of the Red Turban armies led by this guy called Guo Zixing. Guo Zixing recognized the young man's exceptional abilities and intelligence, thought he would be a future leader. Zhu Yuanzhang then would go on to marry Guo Zixing, the army leader's adoptive daughter. Later on, when Guo Zixing passed away, Zhu Yuanzhang would inherit the army.
Okay.
And most of his wealth and go on to become the Hong Emperor and the founder of the Min Dynasty.
So, but didn't the Mongols try and stop them?
They did. But before that, I want to talk about Empress Ma real quick, his wife. Empress Ma was a very interesting character, I thought. She also came from a very poor background, and she famously did not have bound feet, which was not all that strange for a woman came from the working class, a peasant.
Yeah.
But mostly women from, above working class would have their feet to be bound.
Because bound feet is like a show of wealth, right?
Yes.
I don't need my wife for labor.
Yes.
she can just sit there and pop out kids and
Exactly.
make tea or whatever.
So, of course, this was normal for her upbringing. She always convinced Zhu Yuanzhang to be generous and fair towards the rebel soldiers and to be kind to peasants that they have encountered along the way. Zhu Yuanzhang famously won people over to his side by forbidding his soldiers to pillage in observance of White Lotus religious beliefs.
Okay.
Or was it his wife that had convinced him to do so? Some say, had a lot of influence over his policies, which is not a common thing for Chinese empresses.
Yeah,
per se.
I mean, most of the time, they have literally no power.
So Big Feet Empress Ma, which is a nickname for her nowadays in China, thanks to a famous TV show that portrayed her, was a real character, and she was a real peasant empress in a way.
And he was a peasant emperor.
He was a peasant emperor. So Zhu Yuanzhang would continue with his rebel force to overthrow the Yuan dynasty. Of course, he had to take out a few other rebel forces along the way to become the one that made it to the throne. Mandate of heaven at the end.
Yeah.
And in 1356, Zhu Yuanzhang captured the city of Nanjing and made it his capital, a new capital.
Well, I think I read that part of it is also that they thought that Beijing was too close to all these steppe peoples, right? They thought, like, we don't want it there.
Let's have something down south.
We got to have it down south, right? We got to have some space between us and the Mongols.
Have a Han Empire for ourselves. He renamed Nanjing to Yingtian, and it was there that he began to discard his heterodox beliefs. And so he won over the Confucian scholars who issued pronouncements for him and performed the rituals in his claim of the mandate of heaven. And this proven to be very important, as a first step towards establishing a new dynasty. And it sort of separated him from the other rebel leaders.
Yeah.
So mandate of heaven, check. 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang and his army entered the formal capital of Beijing. So this would be, a few years after he established his capital.
Yeah.
And he now took the title of Hong Emperor and founded the Min Dynasty. 21 years later, in 1387, after more than 30 years of war, Zhu Yuanzhang had control all over China. It was really a step-by-step process because the Mongol Empire was so
it's interesting what he did, though, because that's the same thing the Taipings did. The Taipings, the capital was in Beijing. They took Nanjing, and they said that was their new capital, right? And then they went on to take the rest of it.
It was an old playbook. They didn't invent anything there, right? So that was the beginning of the Ming Dynasty.
And that was more successful than Yuan Dynasty. That was like 300 years, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Much longer rule. He was sort of well known for his policies. And famously, he did not like businessmen. He thought China should be a nation of agriculture. That was just,
So he's basically the first Mao.
He didn't hate scholars as much as Mao, but he hated businessmen.
Yeah.
And but interestingly, regardless of his hatred, he couldn't stop the trading from happening. And it was, when the economy is good, trade is going to go up.
The Confucian, there's sort of it's similar in the West, though, where it's like you have this idea of a hierarchy and position. Yeah. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in kind of the Confucian ideology, you have farmers, you have nobles, you have priests, you have the emperor. Mm-hmm. So in France, it was called the three estates, or you have the peasants, you have the priests, and you have the nobility. Yeah. And the people outside of that are considered not as honorable. So like soldiers, I think famously are not really viewed as honorable in Confucianism.
Not really.
Right? And same thing with merchants.
I don't think he thought an empire should be held together by a strong military.
It's like, oh, well, if we need a military, we'll just get some from all these people lying around, right? And then we'll solve it, and then we'll go back to it, right?
But that's not the norm of a society.
Yeah, exactly.
Then the second Peasant Rebellion that I want to talk about is the end of the Ming Dynasty. So Ming Dynasty had lasted almost 300 years. And in 1627, Shanxi province, there was a serious drought happening, and some peasants broke into the local government building and killed the county magistrate, therefore opening the show of many peasant rebellions that had ended the Ming Dynasty. And
it's almost like everybody here is like, oh, the village over there, they're burning down their
let's do it too.
Yeah, let's do it too, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to lose out.
And just like all the other dynasties that came before the Ming Dynasty, the general playbook is the same, although this time a few new factors were introduced to the show. So first, same old natural disasters and extreme weathers. There's this thing, the Little Ice Age.
Oh, yeah. That was in Europe, too.
It occurred after the medieval warm period. It had been traditionally defined as a period of extending from the 16th to the 19th century, although nowadays some experts thinking that it actually went from 13th century to like 1850s. But either way, a period of cooling where the temperature had dropped dramatically. And this happened globally, like you said, in Europe too, but the range of the temperature change was different on each continent.
Do you want to know one theory
Yeah?
that I've seen given? I don't know if it's true, but that it is because of the effects of colonization of the New World. The disease has killed so many people that all of these places that were farmed or tilled or whatever went back to nature, and it sucked all this carbon out of the air.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, but it was bad time for China because, warm weather, agriculture-based economy.
Got to make hay while the sun shines.
Exactly. So yeah, many scholars argue today that the fall of the Min Dynasty at least was partially caused by the Little Ice Age and the droughts and the famine that came after.
So we have natural disasters and we have famine.
Yes.
Okay.
And this time, this is new, we have outside influences. So starting in the 1500s, China started trading with Europeans. And the Portuguese first, and the Spanish, then the Dutch. China now is part of the international trade network, reluctantly and sometimes unofficially.
Yeah.
But still, we're part of it now, like it or not. So the Portuguese first traded Japanese silver for Chinese silk. And then other countries did the same, Japanese silver in exchange for Chinese silk. Okay. Not all the trade was legal, and Spain started cracking down on illegal smuggling in favor of shipping American mined silver through Spanish ports. By American, I guess the American continent.
Yeah, because the Ming Dynasty and I guess the Qing Dynasty famously, they would sell stuff, but you had to only pay in silver.
Yes.
They would not accept anything else. You could not trade one thing for another.
Yeah.
You just had to pay in silver. And they wouldn't buy anything.
No. We don't need anything.
No, yeah.
We don't need anything from the barbarians. What do you have to provide?
Exactly.
So, and then 1639, the new Tokugawa regime of Japan, you know how this goes, shut its door to European traders.
Yeah.
Therefore, cutting off the source of silver coming into China. As a result, the value of silver dramatically increased in China, and most provinces were not able to pay their taxes. And the taxes are collected in silver only. Peasants and traders conduct their local trade and crop sales in copper. So now you have an exchange rate problem.
Yeah.
This is a modern economy problem, right?
So eventually the silver is worth more than the coins.
The exchange rate of copper to silver went into a steep decline. For example, in 1630s, 1,000 copper coin equated to 1 ounce of silver. And within like 20 years, by 1654, 1/3 of an ounce. So think about how much of inflation that is.
Now you need 3,000 coins for an ounce.
Right. So that's crazy. And that's bad because you have to pay the same taxes.
Yes.
You know, the government's not going to go.
And it's not like your food is worth anymore.
Exactly. So that was bad times for all the peasants. And another outside influence is that now on the northern border of China, the Manchurians are becoming a regional player that cannot be ignored. So a Chen, in Chinese Nuzhen tribal leader, united all the Manchurian tribes in the area in early 16th century. Initially, they just sat on the border, but then they broke relations with Ming court in 1610. And in 1618, they demanded a tribute from the Min Dynasty to readdress 7 grievances.
I'm guessing they were BS grievances.
Essentially a declaration of war.
If you're interested, this was in our episode we did about the Great Wall.
Yeah.
But most of what we now think in the West as the Great Wall, and what Chinese people think of the Great Wall, was from this time period, which was the Ming built it to keep out people like the Manchus.
Like the Manchus, yeah. So the 7 grievances against the Min Dynasty. Oh boy. The Ming killed his father and grandfather for no reason. The Ming violated the agreement of territories on both sides. You know, the Ming sent troops to defend his political enemy, another tribal leader.
I know one of the Chinese strategies, right, is they would try and play different tribes off one another. They would give money to one tribe, to the weaker tribe. They would try to break tribes up and try and keep them from unifying.
Yes. In 1638, the Manchu also defeated and conquered Ming China's traditional ally, Korea. Shortly after, the Koreans renounced their long-held loyalty to the Min Dynasty.
Okay. Well, that's kind of a loyalty changed at sword point, I'm sure. Part of the deal is you pay tribute to China, you acknowledge them, but then they have to come help you
Yeah.
if you need it. So like when Japan invaded, China came and helped push the Japanese out.
Yeah.
So it's like if they can't prevent.
Yeah, but you got to provide protection for the vassal. And the dynasty was looking shaky. And besides all these, of course, again, the same old playbook. Corruption around the ruling circles. Apparently the eunuchs now at this time had held enormous power. We have all the checks now.
Yeah.
So as we know, in 1627, some peasants went in and killed some government officials to steal food
and
or whatever.
Set off a whole bunch of other ones.
And in the early 1630, a peasant soldier named Li Zicheng, with his fellow soldiers, they refused to obey orders. He was a soldier of the Min Dynasty army. They refused to obey orders after the Ming government failed to ship much-needed supplies to their unit. Then he was captured by a Ming general and released only on terms that he returned to service. Okay. And the agreement soon broken down when a local magistrate had 36 of his fellow rebels executed. So they killed his man.
Okay.
Broken the agreement, and his troops retaliated by killing the officials and continued to go on with their rebellion now officially. In 1640, masses of China's peasants were starving, unable to pay their taxes, and no longer in fear of the frequently defeated Chinese army. Can't do anything at the border, can't do anything at home either.
Yeah.
Right? So they began to form into huge bands of rebels everywhere. The Chinese military, caught in between failed efforts to defeat the Manchu raiders from the north and huge peasant revolts in every provinces, basically just fell apart. Now they're unpaid and unfed. The army was defeated by Li Zicheng and his force.
Okay, so now the rebels have won, essentially.
Yes. And he had actually self-styled as the Prince of Shrin, another dynasty. Although you don't know this dynasty because it's very short-lived. Okay. And
so he basically is just making up the fact that he's an emperor.
Yes. So on April 25th, 1644, Beijing fell to his army when the city gates were opened by rebel allies from within. And during the turmoil, the last Ming emperor hanged himself on a tree in the imperial garden outside the Forbidden City. Li Zicheng successfully overthrown the dynasty. The story doesn't end there.
Yeah, I know, because the Qing are the next dynasty, not this guy.
Yes, right? But still, the Qin Dynasty was not a peasant rebellion.
No.
The Qin Dynasty was an outside force, really an invasion in a way. Yeah. Right? But they couldn't have... Well, I mean, maybe they could have done it, but Li Zicheng had definitely paved the way.
So then the Manchus came in afterwards.
And defeated Li Zicheng very easily.
So basically, I mean, he was successful.
He was.
Just very short-lived.
So maybe he didn't have the mandate of the heaven.
It's true.
The Qing did.
Yeah.
Right? The Qing came in and claimed the mandate of the heaven.
You have to say they have the mandate of heaven. Because if you're some Confucian scholar and you say, no, they don't have the mandate of heaven, you get killed.
Right?
So there's definitely an incentive.
So, the Shrin Dynasty, very short-lived, soon replaced by the Manchus. Qing Dynasty, as we know it. That was the Peasant Rebellion that had ended the Min Dynasty.
The last Chinese dynasty.
So what do you think of these peasant rebellions, the 4 that we've gone through today?
No, it is interesting, though, because it's like, there is like a checklist, right? Mm-hmm. If those things are happening, we talk about bandits and uprisings and stuff, but it's like the gap between bandits and regular farmers is very small. And a lot of farmers are part-time bandits, right? Yeah. Like it's the off season. If there's times of chaos, well, it's like, well, I can get away with it, right? I can attack this grain shipment. Yeah. I can get my buddies together.
Who's
we can
go
get it, hide it in our barn. Yeah. No one's going to know it was us. And so it's like people are used to doing stuff like this. Mm-hmm. And when there's no authority in place to stop them, it just gets more and more.
Yeah, especially at the end of these stories, you sort of see a pattern. It's like, a good 20 years of just unstable society. And even though the empire hasn't fallen yet, but during those years, these forces form.
Yeah, it's almost like it makes me think of like when you see people like farming like trees, and they just like have the machine and it shakes the tree and like all the nuts fall down. Yeah. That's these rebels. That's these bandits, right? It's like something, it's all normal, and then there's a spark. Yeah. And it's like you just shake the tree and suddenly
they all came out.
They all just came out, right? Yeah. And there's hundreds of thousands or millions of these people, right? Yes.
And then they kill each other, and one of them becomes the emperor.
Yeah. And it is sort of like if you do think of it like, oh, that's what's supposed to happen, it does make sense, right? Because it's like, okay, every once in a while, like, the dynasty gets bad. You have this kind of survival of the fittest, sort of Darwinian thing where all these different rebel groups, one of them becomes the strongest, and the strongest one overthrows China. And sometimes, you'll have 4 or 5, and it could go on for 100 years, like 3 kingdoms, right? Where nobody can agree.
Yeah.
But eventually, always, somebody unifies it, right?
Yes.
So it's not a bug, Cherry. It's a feature.
It's a feature.
That's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah. It's a self-restoring method of the Chinese society.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the dynasty.
It's just very interesting to me that for both the Ren Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty, the system is so flexible that it even can accept just complete foreigners and just integrate them in and go yeah, it's fine. Sometimes we need some outside blood to shake things up.
They have the mandate of the heaven.
Yeah, we need a little bit of, some new ideas, shake things up a little bit.
They were both met with a lot of resistance.
I know, but 100 years later, everyone goes, I guess it was okay.
Yeah, I want the queue.
Yeah.
I want to wear my hair long,
Yeah,
it's not forced upon me.
No, there was also interesting one thing about the Taipings with the queue. A lot of Taipings would cut their queue off.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are on the fence. So they would just stop shaving. So they would have the queue in the back.
Yeah.
But they would have
crazy hair in the front.
Short hair in the front.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And that way, if things went the other way, they could just shave the top of their head off again. Right? And they could fit back in with no, I wasn't a Taiping.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about. Well, anyway, I think we're going to have an interim episode where we review the movie 55 Days in Peking, which is a movie from the 1970s about the Boxer Rebellion. And then we will be coming out with part 2 of our Chinese Peasant Rebellions with some more good ones. So please look forward to that. And thank everybody who watched our original 12 episodes. And please look forward to more.
See you next time.